Welcome. So here we are. This is the Lit Media Workshop. This is a digital media literacy symposium. We're going to go ahead and get started here. All right, slides. So I'm Dr. Linder here. This is our digital media literacy symposium introduction. This is week 1. We're going to go over the introduction today. We're going to go over the topics about myself. We're going to go over the class structure, expectations for you, the student, as well as to define digital media literacy. And we're going to talk a little bit about appreciation. Let's keep going here. Okay, so this is going to be like a 2-semester kind of course. Each of these topics is going to take about 6 weeks. We have the internet, we have chatbots, we have photography, video and film, and these are the topics that we will be covering. So I hope you're excited. I'm excited to teach this class. Who am I? I'm Dr. Linder. I have a PhD in computer science. I work mainly in human-computer interaction. So that's something between computer science and social science, and it's about how people use computers, something in between the psychology of using computers and the act of trying to learn that. Right now, I'm a teaching professor at a state university. I teach mostly AI classes. This semester, I'm teaching artificial intelligence and a class called digital archaeology. I've taught machine learning, deep learning, all kinds of things related to computer science, including human computer interaction, software engineering. So most of my work has been in teaching computer science. I've done coding for a number of years. I did my first video games when I was a teenager. I had internships at some places that you've heard of probably before, such as Adobe Research, Microsoft Research, United States Geological Survey. I've done some writings, some publications, and some things that basically qualify me to be able to teach a class like this. And so, if you're following along at home here, this is part of a class, and this is going to be kind of a flipped class. So, in this class, we'll have this part like now, where you're watching me from your house on YouTube, and then we'll have other things in the class. So it's flipped. Each of these topics is going to be about 6 weeks. We'll have some quizzes in the class. We'll have a little bit of outside reading and some videos that I ask you to watch. There will also be some take-home work and activities. And basically, each one of these modules will end with a kind of a show and tell, a big project at the end. So, for example, on the internet, we'll end up with some kind of a website prototype, and we'll see what happens with the other ones. During class, we're going to have a class discussion, and I'm hoping that because you can watch these videos at home, we'll have more time to do some back and forth among the students. I really like drawing out some of your own conclusions. And at the end of this video, we will talk a little bit about the questions that we'll be having here in just a day or two. In terms of the expectations for you, the student, I expect that you will watch the videos sometime on Wednesday. I'll try to drop these videos Tuesday evening. I want you to try to prepare some questions ahead of time. Something about learning is that the more you pay attention, the more often you can ask yourself questions about anything that you're reading or watching or consuming or creating, and that's typically helpful for your education. Try to be kind and helpful during class. That means try not to talk too much. Make sure that you're talking a little bit, and try to make it where as you're answering questions and asking questions, you do it in a respectful way. I'm trying to run this class as a workshop That means there's going to be a lot of intermediate show and tell. So people will have a lot of incomplete things that they're working on that they may want some feedback on. And so I'm happy to provide that. I'm expecting my students in the class to provide that in as much as they can. So we're all learning together here. I hope to learn from you some things that I don't know yet. Now, let's talk about digital media literacy. One way to define that is, learning how to read, create, and appreciate digitally communicated information and ideas. It's about a proficiency in using the technologies and tools that exist to create things. Pretty much everything that you see today has been mediated somehow by some kind of a computer or a digital system. So we're going to go backwards. We're going to start with literacy, then media, and then digital. And we'll talk about all of these things. Literacy. Literacy is about communication through writing, being able to take something that you might otherwise say and communicate it through writing. You may have noticed that as you're reading things, prose, poetry, novels, newspapers, that all of these different kinds of writing are not exactly the same as how you would explain things when you're just talking out loud. Sometimes people refer to improving your own literacy as language arts. And I think it's important to think of it as an art rather than a science or rather than something that has a definite answer. And so there's a couple of tools. People in human computer interaction like to take tools from all kinds of fields. One of the tools I really like is called the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical situation includes quite a bit of things. The rhetorical triangle refers to, I think it's Aristotle's ideas for being able to communicate things with things that we'll go over later in class. So, when we're talking about something like the rhetorical triangle, 1 second here. One of the things that you see commonly in the rhetorical is a rhetorical context like triangle, where you start with a triangle, and in this triangle, you have something like the subject, you have the audience, and you have a purpose. And all of these things, if they're very strong, you sort of have the most space to talk about the thing that you're talking about. So, for example, when you're writing, the way that you write a poem has a very different purpose than if you were writing a newspaper article. If you were to report on the news only through poetry, that would be strange, right? So you have to know kind of the people that you're talking to. You have to understand what they're expecting. And beyond that, there's also these social norms, these things that come with expectations in whatever kind of media that you're using. This is true for writing, and I think it's a really useful mental tool that we can use to better understand when it's right, when it's appropriate, when it will be received well to do things in a certain way. Okay. Now let's talk about media. Media is the plural of medium. And a medium is basically the kind of material that you're using to perform the communication, just like a physical or digital kind of material. This could be things like a pen and paper, printer and paper, it could be the radio, it could be email, it could be TV, film. There's all kinds of different media, and each medium has its own kind of subject audience, purpose, kind of quality to it. So, um, one of the most simple examples here is this pen and paper, where the paper is the medium and the pen is the tool used to alter that medium. And these have existed for a very long time. For example, um, here on the left, we have this very famous image, which is like a receipt from copper. Someone said, "Hey, you gave me some really bad copper. I don't really like it." There's also like things that are just receipts that we use all of the time. These include, something you might get from Walmart to notice a kind of a sale. And so this is all kind of literature, and historians go back and they look at this literature that gets created just as a consequence of people living. Other kinds of things included like the scroll. The scroll came before books, which is called the codex. This codex, where you have like a thing where you can flip through pages, it changed how people can read. It changed how people could read because, they can compare one chapter with another chapter at the same time without having to unwind everything. And as things changed even more, media became almost it became more like mass media. You had things like the movable type, where you could write something one time and then make many, many, many copies of it. And this brought us things like newspapers. Here's a famous picture from Dewey Defeats Truman. This was actually untrue at the time because they just printed the news that they expected to happen rather than the news that actually did happen. So, along with that speed came some difficulties in terms of spreading information that wasn't necessarily true, or just having fewer sources, or rather having too many sources to really, uh, so many sources that it can basically get confusing what is true and what is false. So, with this rise of mass media, it increased the speed of how fast information could travel. It increased the volume of information that you did have. So people could buy books, people could read things. They could read things like, say, the Bible for themselves, which created the Protestant movement. It also eventually created multimedia. Multimedia being combined media, things like audio and video, things like photographs inside of magazines that otherwise would have text. Um, you had both movies, like silent films, and you had soundies, things that had uh, a moving image and sound, which is just what we call more or less film today. And it's mass media, not because it's bigger media, but because it goes to the masses. It goes to just the general population. Whereas in earlier times, when you're looking at things like scrolls, you might include just a few people in a monastery, or as part of some kind of a group of people who are, elite reading. With mass media, really everybody, or a lot more people anyway, could read and consume this kind of entertainment content. There's all of these different kinds of mass media. Um, and like I said, it sort of started here with the press, where you're being able to copy things over and over again. But just imagine how different it would have been once you could actually have a phonogram. You could play some music for yourself and you could repeat the symphony over and over again. Whereas before, you might have only been able to see it one time. Um, After that, around that time, really, you had things like film, which could like replay certain kinds of experiences. This includes things like silent films, where Charlie Chaplin is playing, I think like it's a hobo or something. And so you had things where it was just moving with a little bit of piano played in the background live, versus some actual live film with sounds like in the movie Vertigo. Now, the mass media, along with it, brought about what Marshall McLuhan calls sort of hot media, very high fidelity, lots of information per, um, well, lots of information, we'll call it per second, that happens there. This includes things like the radio, which was very big and came a lot earlier than the television. Now we have sort of this hi fi stuff which is like very clear and high quality music. This eventually led up to a television where you had shows and people watching TV together. You had shows like the Ed Sullivan Show exposing people to artists like the Beatles. And so everyone's kind of watching together at the same time these shows. Um, Here's Dan Rather from maybe the 90s or the 80s, and he's a big news guy. Everyone watches Dan Rather. Everybody trusts Dan Rather. We're all watching the same kinds of things at this point in history. After that, so then Marshall McLuhan has this famous thing where he talks about the medium is the message. The medium is the message. And basically, what that means is that how you're communicating something, the actual materials carries with it very important information that can color the actual message, the actual content of what you're trying to communicate. And this will be a recurring theme here. Now let's talk about digital. Do you know what digital means? It's basically the process of turning things into zeros or ones. And it's how things like computers process information, remember information, and store different kinds of media. And it's the basis of calculations for the input and output that computers actually generate. And so it's opened up a tremendous amount of new opportunities for art, for creating new understanding, for promoting science, and for doing things at a scale that we've just never been able to do before, as humanity, before now. And we will go over this maybe a little bit in class. I don't know how much we'll go over this in class, but basically you have things like analog technology, things like records, things like actual life and how it happens. These things are analog. They're not what I would call quantized. They're not turned into zeros and ones yet. So, if you are actually, try to change myself here for a minute. If you are actually looking right at something like a record, like a phonograph, right here, right? What's actually happening is a needle goes around in a circle in this phonograph and it bounces up and down. That gets turned into a sound signal. Now, this is analog. It's analog because it's not made of ones and zeros. It's not made of information per se. Instead, it's made of these like wavy things. These wavy things are the information that makes sound. So it looks a little bit close to what I would call a sine wave or some kind of a wavelet or something. Now, what actually happens here in computers across different kinds of technologies is it goes through this kind of a conversion process. Let's take a look at a different kind of medium. So whereas before in a record player, you would physically have all kinds of data in the form of waves all throughout the whole record. Here, in a CD, if you looked very, very closely, you would see something actually pretty similar. You would have a little path that goes around in a circle, but instead of having bright and less bright colored things, you go closely and you'll either see a dot like this, like a big dash inside that a laser can read, or you'll see a big gap here. So this big gap here is the same as a 0, and this big indentation here is the same as a 1. So there's binary information sitting in the CDs. If you compare that to a DVD and you look at sort of the same size, you'll notice that it's packed in with far more information. The reason it's packed in with far more information is because it has to play video. So a CD and a DVD are basically the same size, but the information is much more dense in a DVD because videos take up more space digitally. than audio does. Fascinating. So, what actually happens in a conversion where you might take a record player and hook it up to a computer to try to create a CD, what actually is literally happening is every time it goes forward, it's taking a small sample. It's picking just a small amount of time and it's aligning it like this and it's putting a value there. So at this exact second, the volume is this exact volume. And you'll note here that these curves are smooth, but these curves are digital. They have a discrete, that is a countable actual number. So it's more like an integer like 1, 10, 35, 38 than it is a like a scalar value like 38.2. So when you record from a record player into a CD, you might have to take this kind of information, and this tiny little thing right here might live right about here inside of that CD-ROM. But when you play the CD-ROM, it does the opposite. It converts it from a digital signal to an analog signal. So you go from a digital signal, and then later, this goes into some kind of a speaker system that plays, plays music. And, this is true for sound, but it's a good analogy for all of the different kinds of conversions that happen into digital media, including things like writing. Writing, whereas before it's like um, it's like it includes some emotion. You can tell when somebody's writing really hard and they're really angry versus where they aren't. This would not, when you digitize it, probably include that information. So in this class, we're going to be trying to learn about how to read this information across these different media, how to appreciate and digitally communicate that media through making websites or talking with chatbots or doing digital photography and videography. And I'm very excited about it. I'll go over briefly what I expect to be doing in the next videos that I make and during class. We're going to be talking. There we go. Okay. So, we're going to be talking about the internet. The internet is very cool. It's got all kinds of fun stuff you can do on it. This week, we'll be watching a sort of retro video about using the internet. So I'm very excited to get your reactions from that to understand how you think the internet works. We're going to be paying a lot of attention to themes like the differences between, say, watching television and using the internet. That's coming very soon, so I won't talk too much about it. We're going to be also talking about chatbots. Probably one that you've used or seen before is called ChatGPT. ChatGPT is just one of many different kinds of what we call large language models. That's large language models, or LLMs. LLMs like Gemini or Quant or ChatGPT. They're a little bit like databases, and they're a little bit like amazing AI machines. They work off of probabilities, and we're going to get really into some of the use cases for when they work, when they don't work, how you want to be using them, and how to validate some of the answers that they provide. And in the springtime, eventually we're going to move on to photography. We're going to talk about things like how light works. We're going to talk about Isaac Newton's concepts of lensing, and we'll talk a little bit about Galileo, microscopes, telescopes, but then we'll actually get in the mechanics of how to do digital photography, especially in professional DSLR cameras. So when you're finished looking at this photography module, we'll be talking about things like aperture, ISO, exposure time. We'll be talking about framing, the rules of thirds. So, what is the difference between a good photograph and a bad photograph? And do we ever include that rhetorical triangle? I think we probably do. After that, we'll have another module on film/video. This will include a little bit about the history of places like Hollywood, how film was created, and some different techniques for for communicating in different areas. So we'll look a little bit into things like short form videos, things like TikTok. We will look at especially some films, really old weird films, and talk about some of the psychology behind what makes a film stand out. How does it move people? What are the sort of implicit assumptions that people make depending on how scene changes actually work? And so, through all of these, we'll be going over a little bit of the theory behind it. Things like media studies, Marshall McLuhan will go over some of the psychology and cognition behind it because that's just where my background is and that's what I like to talk about. But we'll also be using a lot of the Socratic method during class time. So if you're just watching this video, try to come up with some questions about some of these here. And I'll be trying to put in as much background reading and watching as I think you can handle, and so we'll just kind of see how it goes here. All right, this is the last slide here. So there's going to be a discussion for class time, and in that discussion, we're going to be mostly talking about the internet. How do you think the internet works? What is it? Where is it? I actually don't want you to look up the answers for this. I'd rather you just come in with whatever, Oh well, we'll leave that in. I'd rather you just come in with information about come in with just however you think the internet works. We'll also be talking for this next week after class. I'll let you know in class, but I want you to watch this thing called Classic 90s, The Kid's Guide to the Internet. It's a very interesting piece of media. It's about 30 minutes long. And your questions basically for that video are going to be, has this changed anything? So we won't talk about that at our very next class, but after you've seen the video in about a week, we will talk about that. So I'm very excited to teach this class. I hope that we learn a lot from each other, and I will see you all next week here. And now I'm going to play this thing again. All right, bye.